Hello, Gary Scott here. I want to talk about innocence. It's come up for me lately as I'm looking at love and the specter of where we find ourselves when we're culturing love or in love or receiving love or giving love. Innocence is, well, looking at the word innocence, it's more about a lack of something, you know, that you're not mentally capable or physically capable or emotionally capable of something, and that designates an innocence. I like to look at innocence more from the viewpoint of I would write the word Inno, and sense, Sense. So it's a sense that we have about ourselves. And where I'm going with that is that there's this primary formation in us that is innocent, that didn't come from some great thing. As children, we come into the world innocently, and then we learn first to operate our body and then our brain in the world around us. And that changes our sense of what I call innocence. So to me, innocence is more about this place, and I that's where I look to what is nature, because nature for me is in a sense innocent. It's not trying to do harm. And though we may have storms and things like that that come up and change things, the forest, the the ground is innocent, and yet things happen to it because of the vestiges of nature. And where I'm going with this is more about how innocence can play a role in our life and help us to discover that nurture nature, that part of us that is restorative and is whole, even though we might have thought that we lost it in life. I see that it's still there, the potential for restoration. And so when we look at science and the quantitative view of things, we get lost in the details and the numbers. I mean, one of my favorite quotes is, and this is from Hafiz, it's a zero is where all the fun begins. Everything else is just counting. So I look at that as our relationship between Kairos and Chronos. So Chronos is linear time. It's time moving in a certain direction. It's come from somewhere and it's going somewhere. And that's what we call history. And Kairos is nonlinear time. And to me, that dance in life as a musician, how do I step out of that timeline and yet remain within it for my fellow musicians? So that's a dance that I've enjoyed. One one person's quote, he's another percussionist of me, was that I was a master of one. One, 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 and ad infinitum. So to me, when we can get to those places, there's a different way that we show up. Our basic nature shows up in more an unconditional space. I'm a healthcare practitioner and I work with people that have chronic pain. And what I find is that the more I can just be a witness for them to what's going on and help them along on their way, an unconditional witness, then I'm actually able to get in their corner in a sense and help them through whatever they need to get through. Have another set of eyes, another perspective, another way of viewing what's happening. We're, in essence, multi-dimensional beings. I mean, what's behind me is from a dragonfly wing, you know, blown up. And, you know, the detail, but also the randomness. Yeah, it's nature. It can be highly organized. And, you know, and that's where I look at the sense of fractals. Like our view, I mean, my belief is, or one of my beliefs is that our view of reality came from a certain time, a very specific time in our world where we put an order to things, and it doesn't change most of our life after that. We get this fixed view of what reality is for us. And so everyone's going to see it slightly differently because of what that one moment was. And we don't really have any roadmap out of that one moment. And that's where it comes in meditation and spirituality. How do we find ways to break up that conundrum, that knot, you know, that was formed from something that happened in our life, you know? I mean, it was a progression of happenings that gave us this sense of this is reality, you know, because it's really all just space, and yet we see forms, and we are controlled by forms, and we are a form, and we get stuck in that. We get caught in that reality of how we show up and what that showing up is, how we tend to fixate on that sense of who we are in the world and what we're doing here. And I'm much more of the adage, you know, we're a spiritual being living in a physical body, and this physical body is our playground. It's a very revered and sacred thing that we get this opportunity to be here and on our soul's journey, whatever that is. I mean, I can't really explain what that might be, but that's where I've led myself within the studies that I have done throughout my life. And that's what makes sense, or the most sense to me. So back to innocence, it's like I look at it more like a sense. You know, when do we come back to our true nature, where we have not been harmed by anything, and we have not harmed anything else. So, and that's more the true innocence, that, you know, we haven't fallen from grace. We haven't, you know, left the garden. And this wonderful teacher, his name was Doc Lindwall. Doc and Ruth, they were a couple. And he had this way of calling up, you know, it was either in this present day, you know, or it came from our past and and our past generation, so intergenerational, so that these senses of ourself, and then it came from past life. So things that are occurring to us right now, you know, have a formation somewhere in the world around us. So in terms of, you know, I acquired it physically in this life. I inherited it through my family and through transgenerational trauma. So there's been a lot of research done with that today that really uh, shows how true that is, and how those traumatic experiences that our grandparents and great grandparents and great great grandparents had, you know, was sent down through our DNA, or what we call epigenetics. So beyond genetics, it came from somewhere else. And so part of our physical job, you know, not only relating to these parents that picked us, whatever their functions and dysfunctions are, that we, I mean, there are essential mentors. They're hardwiring us to live in the world, whether we like it or not. And we have choices along the way. So there's, when we find the right teachers, when we find the right people in our lives, they help us learn to see it differently than we currently see. And that's where that, lifelong learner aspect, really helps us to continue to grow. And when we get locked in a fixed way, I'm this person and I'm doing this, and this is my objective end. We've created a pattern that is not, that's very fixed and not mutable to the things that might happen in the world, in within our body around us. I mean, like looking at illness and how Western medicine looks at it very different than Eastern medicine. And so there's a piece on innocence in the I Ching, and that's the hexagram number 25, and it's really about, that we need to return to the quality of innocence. And I feel like part of our role on the planet right now, as we're experiencing all these changes, these weather changes, all these things that are happening because of what we've done to the planet, that returning to our innocence is a way to start to renew that balance. It's not only our wholeness, it's our wholeness within the system of this planet that needs us right now to make some big changes. And when we're stuck in our patterns of going on a linear path down the road of making money, being in a career, having a family, those type of things, we're stuck in a rigid fractal or formation of the world. And we don't get out of it very, very easily. And a return to innocence is a way, out of, I don't know if it's a way out of the busyness, but innocence to me connotes silence. It's the void, that there is this non-objectivity. I mean, getting back to the definition of innocence, it's not having a physical capacity, it's not having a mental capacity, so it's, in some sense, it's a lack of something that's driving us, and it's more about returning to the wholeness. I mean, I look at that relationship, the relationship between our heart and our mind. It's a tenuous one throughout our lives. The things that we do because we feel something and we follow that feeling, whatever we call that, intuition, and second sense. It's like that's been a primary part of my life, and especially as a healthcare practitioner, especially as a musician, I get to play with that fabric of what is reality, because it's amazing how, I mean, just a really quick example is like I had a client come in to me with severe sciatic condition. They were, it was very difficult for them to do most anything, and they were just at, their end with this. And for some reason, this thought came into my head, what happened 10 years ago? And I asked them that. And it was like I could see the physical space changing. There was something in there for that person that they got a hold of, that, and all of a sudden they started to soften. And like 20 minutes later, they're on my table, and I hardly have to do anything to them because their body is so ready to receive something from me. And so in this particular case, because of my knowledge of the body, with the piriformis muscle, when the sciatic nerve gets out of that little groove, it locks down on it. So it's stretching that nerve, creating these pain patterns in the body in very rigid, direct ways. And and so when this body got so soft and I was able to do this little move over the piriformis, it just like, it all melted, and this person just walked out the door. And, 24 hours later, I get this email and it's like, the pain is gone, you know. And to me, it was like, it was her body that took care of herself. That's where the wisdom came from. And this is where I'm talking about innocence. It's like her body had the ability to do it, but because of the constrictions of our mental space, the viewpoint and how we're trying to get through our traumas, it something changed. So that door opened perceptually for them to receive something that they couldn't receive before. I mean, it was like, it was magic to me. And it was their body's magic. And I participated in that. It's like this what happened 10 years ago just came into my head. I don't, it's like, and it was just like, and I just asked it because it was there. Okay. And it shifted something. And so it's like, there's my innocence. It's not reasoning what's happening. It's just accepting some information and giving it back, to this other being and letting it find its course. As a healthcare practitioner, I tell my clients all the time, the magic is in you. I'm just here to facilitate something. I don't always, there's directions to the path that I follow that help, you know, create these places where things can shift and change. I mean, that's where I look at the word shift. Like, what is it that will help create a shift in your life? Don't know. Each person is going to find that for themselves. And we have this relationship with ourselves that's very direct and very tactile because we feel pain or we feel pleasure or whatever we're feeling. And, how do we learn to rebalance that relationship? So to me, this person was out of balance because of that relationship with themselves was out of balance. And something that I was able to pick up in the ethers, helped change that sense of balance. I mean, it's not perfect, and they're going to go on in life and they're going to have other things to deal with. So, but in this particular condition, in this particular situation, there was extreme rigidity and pain. And this phrase, what happened 10 years ago, unlocked a door that opened a way for this person to participate. I mean, it was like the tissue just melted. I mean, I don't know how else to say that. It was an amazing experience for me. And I've had other amazing experiences as well with people on my table. And so I can't discount that these things will happen. And that's where the more of a witness I am, the more available I am. So in that way, I'm not trying to project myself or my understanding or my reasoning, that'll show up however it needs to show up. All the training, all the research, all the clock hours that I put into this, it's like as a musician, it's getting that 10,000 hours. It's all of a sudden you're not on that linear framework anymore. You're more amorphous. You're more able to move, dance in a sense, transform. I mean, that's what I look at, like the power of water. Water is a transformational element in the world. because it can take so many forms. It can be as soft or it can be as hard. you know I mean, what an amazing substance. you know it can be these tiny light delightful crystals, that are each unique, not the same. I mean, to me, that's the basis of innocence, is that we're all so totally unique. you know None of us are going to be the same. None of us, yeah, even identical twins, you know are going to have different experiences in the world. They might have a great relationship with each other because of that commonality. And they're going to I have a set of twins, grand grandchildren, and they're born 8 minutes apart, and they're so totally different. you know and that just amazes me, that they can be so different. you know and even though they have the same parents and the same socioeconomic situation, all these factors, that play about, but the parents are very different, and what they bring to the children is very different. And what I brought as a grandfather was very different. And that's watching them weave their way through the world. you know their epigenetics have changed. Their ability to navigate the world has changed. I don't know to what degree I've had an impact, and yet I see certain cultural structures. So that's another thing about innocence, is we have these belief systems. And so, like, an example is like voodooism is seen as a closed cultural belief system. It was developed in a small community. They all learned to see things similar, and then it evolved over time, where people rigidly saw those things as real for them. And so, from an outside perspective, it looks really bizarre. How can you stick a pin in a doll and affect somebody else? Or why? Those kind of things. So that's a closed cultural belief system. And a lot of religions are very closed cultural belief systems. We accept a certain identity from that process of learning, from that belief system. And it's usually highly emotional. And there's mental, physical aspects to that. And I'm not saying one is right or wrong. It creates a certain dimension, way of participating, and it locks people into a framework about how they might see the world or participate in the world because of that particular framework. And doesn't give them a lot of latitude to explore, to express themselves. So, I mean, that's where, like, when you look at love and love between people, it's an exploration in the beginning. I mean, that's going to change over time for each person as they get used to another and find out how to do that dance. And, some people can do it really well, and some people, it's harder. And looking at the initial innocence, how do we return to that? How do we find, because to me, that's more about feeling you're whole. And, from a sensory perspective, from a mental, emotional perspective, from a spiritual perspective, how another partner gives us a deeper sense of self when that's possible. I mean, it's not the case for everybody. I mean, people have their linear dreams, I'm going to get this partner and we're going to live out our life and this is what it's going to be. And that's what they do. I mean, that's so much more about, we each control that in a sense, but we may not know we're trying to control that, or a part of ourselves is controlling that, or you get into fate and destiny, It's like I was born with a certain fate, but I created my own destiny out of that. What is that? How does that work? You know, because some people may have some relation to it and some people may not whatsoever, you know, and it really depends on how we are wired early on in life and that fractal that we're seeing the world out of, that brief moment in time when we started to register what things looked like and what things felt like and what things seemed like. When I was probably 8 years old, I was in a church in a Sunday school, and I had two teachers, and one was blind and one was in a wheelchair, and they were a married couple. And we would do these excursions around to the city, downtown Omaha, Nebraska. And it was so beautiful because they had this dance that was just, you felt so held by the dance they had. I mean, you were this bouncy, scraggly, a bunch of kids, going to the park or going to wherever we're going. And, you know, it was like he would tell her exactly, as she needed it, she was pushing him and he was saying what was happening, the light turned green or whatever, But it was such a wonderful way to learn as a child about relationship. And that wasn't the relationship my parents had, you know. They had their own ideas about what that was, and how they functioned within that. And that was how I was raised. And yet this one experience, with these set of teachers was profound for me. I didn't know it at the time, but I saw how much, I came to understand. I don't know if that's the right word, the sense of compassion. I mean, they brought something to me that was about how people could get along, because I didn't see that very often. I saw more of the conflict and discord that happened in the world and less about, I mean, it was just delightful as a kid, you know. They never got angry with each other, you know. And there were more times that they went back into stillness for a brief moment and then they moved forward from there. But it was beautiful that way, that there was like this deep listening that was happening. I think that's more what it was. It was this deep listening. They were really tuned into each other and the protection of us kids together with them. I mean, that's what their concern was. That's what their awareness was. And it was just, I'll never forget that, you know. It took me, to this, I felt so loved. I mean, that's what it came down to, that awareness they had for each other, they had for me as well. You know, bubbly little kid, you know. But it was just like it was so intriguing, and to go back there, it's like, wow, that was an amazing thing to have those two teachers in my life, because they changed something about me, about how aware I was of other people that didn't have the same physical ability as I, or the same mental ability as I. I went on to work in a mental institution. And I mean, that's where I truly learned humanity. And that's where it's like, I mean, there was this one kid named Johnny. I mean, and he was totally innocent. He couldn't do anything about his situation, mentally and physically. And it was a very difficult life for him. And yet, we found this little joy that was just phenomenal. And this relationship I had with him, as an aide in the state mental hospital, it went beyond what I ever thought possible. It's just like he would just laugh and giggle when I would show up. I'd come early. I started at 6:30 in the morning, and I walked 2 miles from my house to get there. And and I come in out of the freezing cold sometimes, and he would just like he would be so happy to see me. They said he couldn't do anything. I knew he could feed himself, you know, and the sense of he couldn't speak really, and yet he really communicated to me what was important to him and the care that I gave him for that brief time that I was there in his life. I mean, it was an amazing experience. I just, I mean, he asked me to be human with him, whatever that was. And I enjoyed that so much. It was so beautiful. And that was a place of innocence for me. Just coming in, having this person on my ward, that was in a bed, or I had to get him out, change his diaper and get him into a wheelchair and get him into the mess hall or whatever. But that sense of innocence that he came from, there was still this peace inside of him that I could connect with. That was what was meaningful to me. That we could sit in the stillness together. And sometimes that was the most profound thing, you know, is just to sit in stillness with him and gaze at each other and not have judgments about anything. I didn't have judgments about him. He didn't have judgments about me that I knew of. I mean, he was purely in delight, to see me. I mean, once we established our relationship, it was just a beautiful thing. And that's like the dragonfly wing behind me. What is nature? And how does nature take care of itself? It There's no one there to take care of it for it. You know, yeah, we're learning very too slowly. And, you know, a windstorm comes up and all these things get broken and they fix themselves. No one told them, you know, and they don't have a lot of ability to respond to that. And if things get taken care of, man does horrible things to the world, and yet things can bounce back and take care of themselves. So I'm really looking at the restorative power of innocence. It's foundational that we can reconnect to something that's inherently our own, that's your own, that was given to you even before birth, and that you hold in your heart and in your head, and that through the right practices, you can rekindle them, you can renew them, and you can be restored. So that's today's journey through innocence. I look forward to our future encounters. Blessings.